It is loud. It's too loud.
Okay, so I'm just going to tell you very, very shortly, in case you didn't read the book, a little bit what the book's about, because what these lovely ladies are going to be talking about is up north and things that have to do with Calumet and where the book was. So this is about a novel about a 25-year-old Annie Clements, and she spent her life in a mining town in Calumet. She is a real person. She struggles to stand up for the miners, and they had a strike, and she was the one who initiated the strike. This all took place in 1913. It was a copper strike, and it was her problems, her husband's problems, the town's problems, and we'll go into it more. It was a book of the Michigan Humanities Choice Award for 2021-22 for Great Michigan Read. We'll talk about it more afterwards, but I really want to get to the three there. Work it. Yeah. Carol Weinstein, Ellstein, yep, and Lynette Webber. And they all have their own things they're going to talk about up there, and I'll let them tell you. So take it away, ladies.
Okay, I'm Susan Burack, and I get to go first. I want to talk initially about living in history. I am a resident of what used to be the Scott Hotel, and if you read the book, you read about Charlie Miller, who was the union organizer. In history, he was Charles Moyer, and he stayed in the Scott Hotel. He was attacked by a posse, a sheriff's posse, and taken from his room in the Scott Hotel and shot and carried across the portage to Houghton from Hancock. From my window, I can see the Glass family residence. And if you read the book, you read about Mr. Glass, Menachem, I believe, who had a store in Calumet, and in the book advises Annie. So that's a bit of living history. We know that in the 1910 census, there were 25 families recorded as Yiddish speakers, and they listed their occupations as peddler, tailor, and storekeeper. One of these was Ida Blum, who in 1913 had just begun teaching school. It was her first year of teaching. My friend Jean Ellis wrote a book based on the 1910 census, and she was good enough to share her information about the Yiddish speakers in that census. The book is titled Beyond Brothels and Bars. And it's an interesting read because it explores the women in 1910 in Calumet, and they were much more than miners' wives. Lynette is holding up a copy of the book. So they had a rabbi for a short time, and they met in a hall that they rented at the top of 5th Street in Calumet, in what is now, above what is now Artist's Books. So if you come to Calumet, you can find where the Jews met. Ida Blum had a confirmation. She was taught by the rabbi. Her father was the proprietor of Blum's Saloon, and we know that the Blum family supplied snacks for the events at the synagogue. We know that copper mining was important for the Jews who came to settle in the copper country. We don't know of Jewish miners, but there is a record of some new immigrants who were recruited as scabs. There were 5 of them. They arrived by train. 1 of them died in the mine, and the remaining 4 appealed to the Jewish merchants for money to leave town. They were not happy being scabs. Temple Jacob was dedicated in September of 1912, room only for the high holy days. And they had a rabbi, there was a kosher butcher, and this is in Hancock. There was a trolley at the time, so the people who lived in Calumet could ride the trolley south to Hancock to the synagogue. But Temple Jacob and the Jewish community were impacted by the strike the following year because the Jewish merchants lost their livelihood when the strikers could no longer afford to shop, and a lot of them left. And I do want to mention that there are 5 windows, stained glass windows. Mrs. B. Glass is one of them. Mrs. Sarah Getz is another. Mr. and Mrs. Meyer Feld, the Ladies Auxiliary, and Mrs. Minnie Abel. And thankfully, Lynette was able to find information about Minnie Abel. She had died shortly before the synagogue was built, and the window was dedicated to her. And I have been talking about some living history and the Jews in Calumet, and I'm going to turn this over to Lynette, who is going to talk about an interesting story about a Jewish woman who lived in Calumet. Take it away, Lynette.
Well, thank you. Let me just reshare a different screen here. And we have a lovely picture of Temple Jacob. And I'm going to start this presentation over.
Lynette, can you turn yours up a little bit? Can you speak up?
Can you hear me all right?
That lives up, and tell them where you live. You good right there.
I feel like I'm missing something.
No, you're fine.
Okay, so when I was asked originally to do a talk about women of the copper country, my first thought went to women who were not seeing, and I think I have a loop, so maybe if somebody else could mute if we've got a repeat going on, that might help. Okay, so I was looking at women who were Big Annie's contemporaries but didn't have any books written about them. And one of the most intriguing women that I came across was Bessie Altmankoffman, who at the time of the 1913 strike was almost the same exact age as Big Annie was. And she was resident here in Calumet, but her circumstances were very different than Annie's. So I started comparing what we can learn from census records to what we can pull in if we use broader varieties of sources. And census records can tell us quite a few things about Bessie Altmankoffman. We know that she lived in Duluth, Minnesota with her parents, sisters, and grandmother in the 1900 census. By 1910, she was wife of Louis Orlaib Kaufman, who was a typesetter living on 8th Street in today's downtown historic Calumet. She was mother of 1 by 1910, and they'd been married for 2 years. By 1920, we find Bessie as a widow, a mother of 2 boys, and she's a saleswoman who lives in Lorium, which, if you recall from the novel, is really just across the street from Calumet. All of the census records agree that she was born in Russia, and her first language is listed either as Russian or Jewish. The place in Russia where she was born is actually in today's Ukraine. It was a village called Haisin or Gaisin. And the family immigrated in 1892, and they were naturalized while living in Duluth in 1898. But these records don't tell us about what happened to bring the Altman family to Calumet and the great tragedy of Bessie's life. So the steamer Bon Voyage was a pleasure and passenger vessel that is pictured on the screen here. And in May of 1901, Bernard Altman, Bessie's father, had moved to Calumet and set up a shop and asked his family to join him. So on May 10th of 1901, the family was on board the steamer Bon Voyage, and they were nearing the Keweenaw Peninsula, where the father of the family was awaiting their arrival, when a fire started around the smokestack. Due to a lack of training and practice, the crew was unprepared for the emergency. The Altman family's trouble mainly was because they were aft while the crew, lifeboats, and jackets were forward. The account by Bessie later stated that the upper part of the boat was on fire, so they all had to go down, and they wound up in the dining room. A cook agreed to help and rushed out. Whether he locked the door on purpose or it locked when it slammed will never be known, but the family was trapped in the kitchen until they discovered a trapdoor in the ceiling. They used it as an escape route and were still on the opposite side from the crew. So in order to reach life jackets, crew, and lifeboats, they started to make their way along narrow railings towards the forward section of the ship. And it was during this period when all of the Altman women, Ada Altman, the mother of the family, her mother, Lizzie Sharp, the children's grandmother, and 3 Altman girls, the eldest, Bessie, 15, fell into the waves. Bessie was the only one who was later rescued alive. So when Bessie came to Calumet, it was an incredible tragedy. And her very first introduction to the area would have been to the new Congregation Pen El Jewish Cemetery in the small suburb of Lakeview. And recently, in the last decade, it has been cleaned up by Susan and some others, the community volunteers. And this is a photo of what is believed to be the Altman plot, where 4 female members of the Altman family were buried in 1901. Bessie's father shortly remarried, and she had a couple of little brothers. She attended normal school, I believe probably in Minnesota, but I have yet to find a record and hopefully a picture of her. I really think this is one place I might be able to someday find a picture of Bessie. And she married Louis or Labe in 1908. And they were married for less than a year when they had their first child, and he learned that he was ill with tuberculosis. So his tuberculosis was treated initially at a typesetters union home in Colorado, as he was a member of the typesetters union. But eventually he returned home for a short period of time before being sent to the county sanitarium, where he eventually ended up passing away. During this time, Bessie ended up having their second child while she was already alone in the home. And she was struggling. She began to sell her household goods, such as a Wellington piano, for cheap. Just outside of Lorium is a small area known as Florida Location. And there were actually several Jewish families living in Florida Location about this time period. So it seems likely she went there for some measure of community support, because She has more than one address in Florida location during the period 1911 to 1912. And the second clipping that I have on the bottom here is actually from the newspaper Poor Rolls. Louis died, and within a couple of months, she was receiving aid from the county. But within a few months after that, his insurance through his typesetters union kicked in, and she had a little bit of seed money to decide on what her next move would be. So in 1912, while Louis was ill and away, Bessie got busy with her dad, and they invented a clothespin. And it was patented in 1914, with the records indicating alternately that they were both of Lorium, or that he was of Lorium and she was of Duluth, Minnesota. So I was able to use this information to not only see how innovative Bessie was, but also that she's the same Bessie Altmankoffman that we look at in Duluth during the same period, where she ends up having a pretty disastrous fire in one building, but in another city directory, which is sort of a phone book from before everyone had phones, telling people where people worked and where they could be found. We see that by 1915, Bessie A. Kosman is the proprietor of the Grand Theater in Duluth. But by 1916, she was moving back to the copper country. In January Motography from 1916, we see that she had purchased the equipment from a theater in Hancock and was moving it up to Meek at the edge of Keweenaw County, where it would be a pretty early motion picture theater. This is the only time I see Bessie Kosman, although she does continue during that year in later professional journals, but she's referred to rather than as Bessie or Mrs. Kosman. Now she's Manager Kosman. Around 1917, she sold the interest in that theater, and all the credit for founding it and all of the history books where it even gets a one-line mention. It mentions the guy she sells it to as the establisher, although she seems to have actually done all of the work in getting investors and building the actual theater, as well as moving the theater equipment there. So I think this was Bessie's Rex Theater. She starts a career in sales for a company that her late husband had worked for, and ends up moving to Detroit in the mid-20s, it seems, for opportunities for their two sons, who both graduate from the University of California. And they were funded partially by Jewish widow scholarships that were available there at Berkeley. Bessie remarries finally in 1937 at the age of 51, after the boys have both graduated from college, to Gordon McKee in Detroit, and their rabbi was presently serving at Temple Bethel. So Bessie probably was involved at the very beginning of Temple Jacob, but her family would have seen her move to the Detroit area and eventually California, continuing with their version of the American dream that might have seemed really impossible for a part of her childhood. And there's that beautiful picture of the windows again. So that is my favorite contemporary Jewish woman to Big Annie so far. And I'm happy to now pass it off to Carol.
Okay. Wow, this is great information. I tried to do a little history on the temple in Calumet, which was Congregation Peniel, which is also the name of the cemetery. It was a standalone cemetery in also called Jewish Lakeview Cemetery in the community of Lakeview, as was previously mentioned. And I'm not doing screen sharing, but I came across a couple of pictures. Can you guys see this? Can you see as I hold it up? It's a view of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
We can see it, but it's like looking in the mirror at it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's not going to help me anymore. We're talking about, I just want to let you know, for those of you who have never been to the UP, We're talking about over the Mackinac Bridge, the upper, thank you, Lynette's showing it. The upper, where her thumb is, that's the part that we're talking about. From northern Michigan, where I used to live, which was about 3.5 hours from Metro Detroit, it was a 6-hour drive to the Keweenaw Peninsula. And I was about a half hour below the Mackinac Bridge. So we're talking about a 10-hour drive from Detroit to Calumet in the Upper Peninsula, where we're talking, that little thumb that came out and juts out into Lake Superior. Pretty remote country. I also have a picture of Temple Jacob that I really wasn't able to show so well. That's probably going to be the mirror image too, but it's a beautiful congregation. And I want to encourage people that if you want to take a little vacation, take a little driving vacation up to the UP. You will see it as you cross the bridge from Houghton to Hancock. It is right at the top of the bridge. So a little history. It's hard to find good history that is unique, but I found a couple of with regard to Temple Jacob. It said, according to the 1910 census, there were about 100 Jewish families. I don't know if you picked that up, Susan. I saw that in a couple of sources. By 1919, after the copper mine problems, after the Italian Hall catastrophe, murders, whatever you want to call it, by people started to leave the copper industry dried up. And by 1919, there were about 30 households in Temple Jacob. So Temple Jacob has been for over a century a very small congregation that is really a jewel among congregations in northern Michigan. Absolutely worth a visit if you get up there. I understand it was purchased from the Quinsing Mining Company for $900 in like the late 1800s, I believe, maybe the early 1900s before it was built. In terms of the cemetery, there was a congregation in Calumet, as I mentioned, called Congregation Peniel. I have found no reference to it, no historical information about it in anything that I read. So the Jewish population that lived in Calumet and Laurium, which is its sister city next door, or in the Florida district area, which I've seen several times, eventually transferred over to Temple Jacob in Hancock, which would have been, what, about a 25-minute drive, half-hour drive, Susan, you think? Longer? Yeah, you're muted.
We had that streetcar system, so it would have been a pretty ready access.
Right, okay. So Temple Jacob, it eventually serviced all of the community. In 1900, September 14th, 1900, there's a record of a man named Max Gittler who bought 3 acres next to the town of Lakewood for Jewish burial. Usually when in the construction of Jewish congregations, the cemeteries come first. That cemetery turned out to be on rough land, and it was used for about 10 years. But you can find references to Peniel Cemetery in Calumet or Jewish Lakeview Cemetery.
Carol, no one was buried there after 1910.
Right. So which conforms with my information, because he bought it in 1900. So the Jews who moved up to this godforsaken place in northern Michigan moved in as peddlers from escaping punishment, crime, pogroms in Germany, in Poland, in Russia. And they became eventually store owners. And one of the things that they did is they brought competition to the company store. Calumet and Hecla Mining Company was a mining company that supported people from cradle to grave, is what it was called, which meant that they built houses for people. They tried to do everything not to have a union in.
Sorry. I'm really good at this, aren't I?
Huh?
They can't see you because I just took you off.
Oh,
I know, but I need to get you back. Keep going, keep going.
Okay.
I'll try to figure it out.
okay. I can see me and I can see the three of us actually. So,
I know.
but okay. Well, you've seen me once, you've seen me all.
I'm so sorry.
And anyway, so Jews settled there, the small community, as peddlers, as storekeepers, as dry goods salespeople. And there was a rabbi named Rabbi Zussman who lived in Lorium. And, huh?
Thank you.
And-
Oh my God, you're so good. Thank
And
you,
then
Gail.
he moved on to Appleton, Wisconsin, which is where a lot of people moved. You know, I'm struck by Bessie Altman's story as a resourceful woman who moved, set herself up, reinvented herself in various ways, and ended up in Detroit. And that's what happened as the copper mining dried up. People moved on, including Jews. So very, very small community is left. If you're interested in more in the 1913 massacre at Italian Hall, Woody Guthrie wrote a song called, aptly titled, 1913 Massacre, and you can find it. Then in 1914, the Italian Hall was demolished. There is a reminder of it. Isn't it in Calumet, the arch, I think is still there. I don't know if that was a real thing or if that was a recreation.
Yeah, the arch was saved when it was demolished in 1984. And Woody Guthrie's artistic license has been the topic of a number of really good books, including Grown Up Anger, the one that I would recommend.
Great, great. That's the stuff that, of course, my searches of history don't tell. So when we're reading history, it's always, interesting to get a smattering of fact, but not always such great information. Anyway, that's where we're at right now. And I guess that stops my conversation. That's all I found. So I'll turn it back to you, Margie.
Okay, does anyone have questions for them? Any of this? Anyone have questions? No? You did a great, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. You did a great job, ladies. Thank you. And Lynette lives in the, if you notice, Lynette is with the Historical Park Service, right? In Keweenaw. So she, yeah.
Temple Jacob still functions.
Yeah.
There are about 6 families. We have davened, we prayed in that building. And as you come up from the south, it has a copper roof.
Yeah.
And you can see it from miles away, and the sun shines off of the
they have
off of the roof. But
they
it
have
only
a-
has about 6 or 7 families.
They have a consortium in
Susan
the
is
upper part.
from there. Synagogue.
Susan, yeah.
In the upper right hand corner.
Oh, okay. You're from the synagogue he's talking about. Small synagogue, Jacob.
Yes.
And we have somebody in our audience, Rachel, who I happen to know. I work with her daughter, actually. His son lives in Calumet. So is he a member of the congregation there? Your son lives in Calumet. What is your son's name? Maybe. Come up closer, Rachel. Sorry, Nicole.
Eli. Talking. Susan,
Is that Eli Jensen?
yeah.
Eli helped us clean up the Calumet Jewish Cemetery, the Peniel Cemetery.
Small world.
We're gonna discuss the book now. You wanna stay on or say goodbye to us?
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay. Did you want to stay on with us? We're going to do a book discussion, or do you want to get off? Whatever you'd like to do.
I think
Uh,
regretfully, I am going to get off because I just received a call that I am going to want to return. So
We really, really appreciate your knowledge. Thank you so much. Carol, see you later.
yep. Bye-bye.
Here with clapping frame. Okay, what are you gonna do, guys?
I'm going to stop recording.
I'd like to hear the discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to try to listen in, but if I can't